so I'm going to get to the, I want to get to the homily Narboni piece, which is this very influential piece written in 1969, a year after May 68 in France. And it's significant then that it's also in Cahiers de Cinema, which is the journal that André Bazin had started almost 30 years before. The journal that Godard and Truffaut wrote for, that was the sort of tourist, cinephilic journal. And then in 1969, it's proposing that from now on, they're going to do the scientific criticism of capitalist ideology. Right? This is a break, right? It's a complete shift in focus, but there are all kinds of interesting actual connections to the earlier manifestations of the journal, as there are also very explicit attacks on the earlier manifestation. But I wanted to, before getting into the Homily Narboni, I'm just going to show a short excerpt from a documentary on May 68 in France to set a little bit of the context. So this documentary is not necessarily anything special, but it gives you some of the flavor for the era and what was going on, and it gives it to you in a way that emphasizes some of the significance of film culture in that moment. Because there was this fact, as you'll see in a second, in which the rallies over the Cinémathèque in France, the fact that they wanted to depose Henri Langlois, who is this very important figure in the French Cinémathèque, helped spark some of the events of May 68. I mean, how crucial this particular event was is certainly debatable, but it was definitely a major event in terms of creating the climate that would produce May 68. And that's what this excerpt of the film starts out with. So this is just about 9 minutes long. And the image quality won't be great.
The French new wave of directors rallied to support their mentor Henri Langlois in February 1968, when the French government, who funded the Cinémathèque, suddenly dismissed its eccentric director for incompetent administration. Messages of support came from filmmakers all over the world. On the 14th of February, 3,000 people turned out at the Palais de Chaillot to protest. On that fateful day in February 1968, events took an unexpectedly violent turn.
It was really rather incredible. On the one hand, you had these kind of nerdy characters and the film buffs holding up banners that said "Film pas flic," films not cops. And suddenly there were these robots, these guys with their masks and their truncheons and their riot guns and their stun weaponry or whatever. And they suddenly charged. Not only was I chased by the police and my fellow film buffs, but Truffaut was beaten over the head and his forehead was bloodied, and Godard was pushed around, and these were, prominent personalities in French culture.
I think in de Gaulle's France, the apparatus of repression in academia, in higher education, was probably stronger than anywhere else, and it was quite strong everywhere. At the Grand Maître, the great leaders of the schools of the University of Paris would have enormous power, and students were kept down. And in the new University of Paris, in Vincennes, where the troubles begin, I think the authorities are having difficulty inventing a new type of university for the great horde of new students who turn up.
To help relieve the pressure of a growing student population, the government built a new university in the working-class neighbourhood of Nanterre. Here, 19,000 students are crammed into a modern but small facility, and they are daily elbow to elbow at cafes and on the streets with workers. The politics of the time, stirred primarily by growing protests against the US war in Vietnam, is creeping into the student population. The administration building is occupied by 150 students claiming to be anarchists. The university is closed until April the 1st.
And so this is where you get the first clashes, and the university authorities call in the cops. And the cops are used to dealing pretty brutally with demonstrators. They've dealt brutally with Algerian demonstrators in recent times. And so they wield their clubs, and actually, before long, the whole clash spirals in the most extraordinary way. I think largely because of the media. There are a lot of television people around in Paris at this time. There's the Vietnam peace talks going on in Paris.
A militant student group forms out of the event, calling itself the March 22nd movement. One of its leaders is Daniel Cohn-Bendit. Following an action in April, Cohn-Bendit is arrested. 400 students from Nanterre go to Paris and to the Sorbonne to protest.
I think there was something there which reached out beyond the normal. The fact that the French government, tried to deport him because he was technically of German birth. The fact that hundreds of thousands of young French workers, as well as students, demonstrated using the banner "Bring back Cohn-Bendit, we are all German Jews." He was a German Jew. Somehow they were revolting against stereotypes of nationality and race as much as stereotypes of consumerism and stereotypes of the well-behaved student and worker.
The police attacks wake up the student population, and the 400 swells to several thousand. It takes 5 hours to quell the disturbance.
This first means that more and more students come out. Students who aren't necessarily political, but just think authority's gone mad, and who also feel stifled by Gaullist paternalism.
More than 100 people are injured. Close to 600 are arrested. That week, tens of thousands of posters calling for action begin to appear in Paris. While the Prime Minister of France, Georges Pompidou, makes state visits to Iran and to Afghanistan, courses at Nanterre are suspended due to the Cohn-Bendit incident. Courses at the Sorbonne are suspended indefinitely. Meanwhile, two unions, the UNEF and the SNESUP, call for unlimited strikes. As the protests become battles, 600 students are hurt, 345 police are wounded, and 422 arrests are made.
What had begun in March 1968 as a student revolt at Nanterre on the outskirts of Paris, by May had become a nationwide protest against the French political regime. Major factories were closed down by strikes, and in Paris, students occupied the University of the Sorbonne.
For the moment then, calm and even gaiety here in the students back in the university and in complete control of the place. They even set up their own committees to organise their lectures and what they're going to do next.
Television has a new importance in France in the 1960s. In fact, it's only in the 1960s that most French families get a television. One of the first big events to take place before the film cameras, so far as the majority of French people are concerned, are these remarkable events of May where they see the police clubbing students who might be their own sons and daughters. And it's this that creates, out of what began as a quarrel about what students should be doing in a few dorms, something that is in fact a national political crisis.
By the 16th, strikes hit all over the country. Every kind of business and almost every corner of society, air transport, newspaper deliveries grind to a halt. In 4 days, an estimated 10 million workers will be on strike. By the 18th, filmmakers from around the world join in a boycott of the Cannes Film Festival, and film professionals occupy the festival offices. The jury resigns and the festival is cancelled.
As the demonstrations in the Latin Quarter became a serious threat to the government, they brought in the CRS, the riot police, just as they had a few months earlier at the Cinémathèque at Chaillot.
This was the first time in France that that generation of young people had actually managed to effect a change. And it may not have seemed a momentous change. It was, after all, a reinstating of a museum curator. But there was something there, a seed that was sown. And there was a sense that this kind of activism could actually succeed.
Prime Minister Georges Pompidou negotiates with everybody. An agreement is reached between the unions, employers' associations and the government. The following agreements are made. The minimum wage is to be raised, working hours cut, there is to be a reduction in the age of retirement, and workers are given the right to organise. Georges Pompidou accepts the resignation of the Minister of Education.
I feel like that gives a useful, quick feeling for the events of May '68 and also the particular role that film culture played in it or was perceived to have played in it, and is something of a useful background for Comolli and Narboni. And I think it's important, as we also are aware of the French theory spreading to the US and to Britain and so on in this very politicized manner, that '68, of course, is not only France. I mean, that there were revolts of a similar nature, strikes, student occupations, and so on, all over the world, really, including in the countries where this film theory is getting taken up, in the US and Britain and so on. So it's, I think, then useful to see this Comolli and Narboni as this piece as a sort of statement of purpose after May '68 about what film theory now needs to accomplish. And it's also now about theory. It's no longer just about criticism or celebration of films, but it's about theoretically, or using a kind of scientific criticism in their words, thinking through how films function in society. Right? And this becomes a very influential statement. And it's worth remembering that this is the same journal, right, that is the Journal of Bazin, is the Journal of Truffaut, and was essentially not a political journal throughout the 1950s. It was a rebellious journal, perhaps, but many of the figures associated with the French New Wave were also often thought to be somewhat conservative, not politically, not political radicals, and someone like Godard will become a political radical after May '68, but wasn't beforehand. So we get in the Comolli Narboni article both a theory and a program of how to approach cinema in relation to ideology. And it has certain, it's highly influenced by Althusser, which is explicit in it. there's certain echoes of Baudry that the emphasis, I think, is rather different. What we also see here, which I think is important for us, is to recognize is a kind of indirect but nonetheless very strong attack on what is perceived as the tradition of cahiers de cinema and of Bazin in particular. So I want to both go over some of their central arguments and also point out some of the sort of jabs at Bazin, or at least the rethinking of Bazin in this new historical moment. So the idea then is that film theory now is going to investigate how dominant modes of cinematic expression position spectators as subjects in that Althusserian way. And like Baudry, they also want to show how filmmakers and critics can contest or resist that positioning. So both the function of dominant ideology in cinema and also what are perhaps ways of challenging it as well. So ideology then, and what they're suggesting is a kind of ideology critique of all cinema, is then a theory of the production, circulation, and viewing of films in general. And one of their initial claims, right, is that every film is political. And this is central to the statement of purpose, right? Every film is political. Every film is political. Why? Because it is determined by the ideology which produces it, right? It's a social phenomenon. It's a signifying practice within a society, and it's therefore taking a stance on that society, and there's no way around that, right? And we have to analyze that, and we have to promote the films that are challenging dominant ideology. So how do we do that? Well, I mean, I wanted to say too that the idea of extending the conception of politics across into, presumably private spheres or spheres that weren't necessarily associated with politics before was a kind of central gesture of the 60s, right, that this emerges out of. This is not simply an Althusserian move, but this is part of a certain moment in political awareness, I think, in the 1960s, which is to say that, and is certainly part of the Althusser piece as well, which is to say that politics, and if we're analyzing the politics of the films, we're no longer just looking at, how government functions in the films, or what we explicitly call the political realm is performed in the films. But no, that politics extends to the family, the school, our bodies, our culture, our media, and so on, and that it has a kind of reach across the kind of daily practices that constitute ideology that Althusser is emphasizing. So how do we challenge dominant ideology? So what they propose then, in a way quite similar to Baudry at this level, right, is we have to then look at which films let the dominant ideology be transmitted without any kind of criticism or complication, that allow it just to be transmitted unhampered, they say. And we need to critique those films for their ideologies. And then we have to see which films then reveal ideological mechanisms within the films themselves. So this is the side that gestures toward that last part of Baudry where he points to someone like Giga Vertov as revealing the mechanisms of production within the film. So films cannot get us outside ideology, but they can reveal their own conditions of production. They can expose ideology within the film and therefore then be political in a more emphatic sense, right? So there's the sense in which all films are political, yes, but all films are political in the sense that in many ways they're hiding their politics, right? They're political because they're ideological, but there is a kind of more genuinely political film in a positive sense that they want to emphasize against the normal range of ideological cinema. Okay, so before we get to their different categories, because it's not just films which deliver ideology and films which challenge it, right? They have 7 different categories of ways of challenging ideology. I just want to point out a couple of the ways in which they are, while not naming names, very much going against a kind of Bazanian heritage that is part of the magazine, right? So they say, for example, the main question now is not what is cinema, but what is film today, right? So that's one reference, without naming his name, to the title of Bazin's volumes of criticism, what is cinema. And the point is, right, that we can no longer think about medium specificity in some kind of general, broad sense. We have to locate it in the specific material conditions of the current historical moment and reflect on our own position as viewers and critics within that system that we're analyzing it from, right? And Bazin did not make, and there are perhaps ways in which Bazin did do that occasionally, but it certainly wasn't his axiom, his point of departure. Okay, so the other central thing to take notice of in that respect, is that the main enemy is what they call realism, right? And what they mean by realism is not really what Bazin meant by realism. Bazin meant, as we know, something more complicated than what one would associate with the verisimilitude of traditional Hollywood cinema. He meant something, he first of all believed that there were many different kinds of realism, and he was promoting a certain kind that involved ambiguity, right, as we know. A sort of ethical approach to reality and so on. But for them, right, as they say, reality is nothing but an expression of the dominant ideology, right? Reality is only a reality effect. Films give us the feeling of reality, the effect of reality, but that's a way of signifying. It's reality is always constructed. There is no truer reality. There's only different levels of ideology. Okay, so there are categories. There are 7 of them, right? I don't necessarily, these are just quick shorthands for them. You won't know what any of them mean just by writing them down. But the important part, I want to just emphasize a few elements of the different categories. I won't go into detail about all of them. I mean, we could analyze all these different categories. But the goal then is to, as they say, show up the depiction of reality. Make films not about a kind of transparent communication where we don't think about how films are constructed, how films signify, and we just let them wash over us. That's the essential enemy for them, right? And to show up the depiction of reality is done two ways. One way is within films themselves, and the other way is by a kind of materialist, historical materialist criticism that they're proposing we practice. So I just want to highlight some of the terminology and their different categories, right? So the first category is just the worst of dominant cinema, according to them. That's all the films that allow ideology to be transmitted without any complication whatsoever. The sort of whole bag of tricks, they say, of the type of cinema that is in some ways associated with classical Hollywood, of course, and that's another way, obviously, they're challenging, in some ways, the heritage of Kaida cinema, which was very much, as we've seen, about promoting classical Hollywood. But they're also talking, of course, about a lot of mainstream French cinema as well. Okay, so there are three positive categories, three explicitly political categories, and B and C are two of the three. And I just want to highlight this distinction then, which is this structuralist or semiotic distinction that we've seen before between signifier and signified. As I mentioned to you, right, the signifier refers to the actual sign on the screen, whether an image or a word or whatever, and the signified is what it signifies, right? So these are, in effect, quasi-synonyms for form and content, right? The signifier refers to the form of the film, and the signified refers to its content. So the point then is to break up the question of politics in terms of both form and content. And this is an element that we see in Laura Mulvey, we see in Baudry as well, in which all of these theorists are promoting a political cinema that's very much about form, right? The idea of presenting some film that just presents, how the world should be, or presents, good political actions that challenge repressive or ideological institutions, is not in itself particularly progressive for them. It's a question of, at the level of cinema itself, changing how we watch films, changing the elements that make up the apparatus, right? That make up our viewing experience and that make up the way in which films tend to be organized, right? So the category B, which for them is probably the most favored, are films that are both political at the level of content, they're about some aspect of politics, and they are also political at the level of the signifier in terms of form. But they also suggest that films just political at the level of the signifier, that seem to have absolutely no political content whatsoever, are also important politically, because they challenge the way we watch film. So you'll see they list examples, and they include Bergman's Persona, for example, which one wouldn't necessarily think of as a political film, but for them it is based on the way it challenges our viewing process. And then category D is when we just have a politics of the signified. So in other words, they're thinking of sort of left-wing films that have explicitly political content they might endorse, but for them these films need to be criticized, right? They need to be criticized because the issue is about form as well as content. And they're extremely critical, and Paillet continued to be extremely critical of films that were conventionally made, used all the bag of tricks of continuity editing and narrative tension to elicit certain kinds of audience responses in favor of some left-wing cause. For them was a problem, right? Because it was not actually making us rethink the ideological apparatus of cinema itself, and it was reinforcing it. So they, in each category they have a list of films, which, you can look these up, but you can also perhaps think of current examples of this kind of thing. I mean, they would be very critical of certain kinds of, conventional biopics that may present sort of goodwill, political, revolutionary material, but without, in fact, challenging the way we view film. Category E is interesting because it's their last holdout toward the old Bazanian auteurist line, right? So they want to say, oh yes, there are a bunch of films that look like conventional films, but because they are so, and the form is not new or radical or surprising, but they undermine their ideology within the film in very subtle ways, right? Without even knowing it necessarily. And for them, that includes then a lot of the filmmakers that Caillé had endorsed in the 50s and 60s, and it's a way of redeeming them in a way. That, filmmakers like Nicholas Ray or John Ford, who are making these very mainstream films, could still be redeemed because there's something in the form that is ambiguous in relationship to the dominant mode of representation which they take up. That they're cracks or fissures, they say, contradictions that emerge. And then the last two categories are these documentary categories. One of them being the type of documentary, and they're mainly talking about direct cinema as a kind of new movement of the time, that the bad version being the one that seems to endorse the reality of the world we're seeing without any complication, without making us think about the representation at all, that wants the camera to be invisible and so on. So again, that sort of invisibility of the filmmaking is for them the biggest enemy in this political moment. Whereas there are direct cinema films, they suggest, that the people who are being filmed are not being filmed as if they already exist, but are actually contributing to the filmmaking process, or involved in it in somehow. And the film is being created while it's being filmed in a way that gives it a more radical political dimension for them. So those are the sort of different categories they've created, and it became a kind of useful theoretical template, both for people to follow, but also to argue with, right? To think about the different ways that films function in terms of ideology. So any questions about anything I've said so far, or statements, objections? If not, I'll say a few words about the Stuart Hall piece. So the Stuart Hall piece, called Encoding, Decoding, is written by a figure, Stuart Hall, who's very associated with British cultural studies. So it's a few years later, it's 1973. He's Jamaican by birth, and he also just passed away, I should say, in February this year. It's extremely important and interesting figure, Stuart Hall, and I think he has a lot of writing that's actually much more engaging than this piece. This is not one of his more exciting to read pieces, but it's an extremely influential piece in analyzing media. In any event, his main focus is television, right? And he's writing in the British context, but he gives certain terminology to some degree influenced by Barthes. He certainly read Althusser, and Antonio Gramsci, the Italian Marxist, is another sort of central figure for this moment in British cultural studies. And so, one thing to highlight here is just then the question of TV instead of film, and this will be a question that'll also continue in terms of what we'll watch in a moment as well. But much of what he says could go for film as well. He's not talking about specific types of programs, but in some sense the apparatus of television in general. And what's significant about this piece is the various ways he talks about the different types of reading strategies that approach television, right? So he's very much in line, though using a slightly different vocabulary, with the other people we've read. He wants to talk about how all television is a discourse, right? Even the news, right? It takes an event, he says, and makes it a story, right? It's nothing has a kind of transparent relationship to reality. We always have to see these things in terms of their production, their circulation, their distribution, and the various formal strategies used in terms of how they're made. And he emphasizes, of course, the question of ideology itself, which he associates with another binary opposition that's familiar to semiotics and structuralism, which is that between denotation and connotation. Right? So a signifier denotes something, which is it sort of has no specific implication in terms of culture, it's just its direct reference, but it also has connotations, and connotations then are a way to talk about the ideology of the signifier. So the central intervention here then in relation to some of these other arguments about ideology in cinema is the emphasis on the way in which dominant ideology itself can fail. And that there can be ways of reading films or TV that is not the way that it wants to be read. So he then proposes three different forms of positions in which subjects can experience television. So the first is the dominant, position, the hegemonic position. This is this word from that is associated with Antonio Gramsci, which essentially means dominant, right? The hegemonic ideas are the dominant ideology. So most people presumably then read television in terms of the dominant mode, right? So he's saying that the making of a television show involves an encoding, right? It takes this raw material and encodes it in a certain way. And then when you watch it, he says you decode it. And the important thing then for Hall is that these things aren't symmetrical. You don't decode it exactly the way it was encoded, right? You don't wind up with the exact same thing, the same raw material that was put into it in the first place. So Hall provides an intervention by proposing the way in which media are made and the ideology that they bear, right, the ways in which they are encoded is not in one-to-one correspondence with how they are received by viewers or decoded. And so this doesn't mean that TV shows don't transmit ideology and can't be critiqued ideologically in terms of the ways in which they reinforce dominant ideologies. But the point is that while many viewers will respond by absorbing these dominant hegemonic codes without criticism, you can also read oppositionally. You can perform forms of critique yourself, and different social groups will tend to perform different kinds of critique. So the ideology then is not always successful, and there's a struggle over discourse in any kind of mass consumption, he wants to say. So the negotiated reading is then one that is more ambivalent, right, where you take in the dominant ideology, probably accept it to some degree, but it's somehow inflected by your own social or historical position. It's complicated by it. Whereas the oppositional reading is when you directly reject and read against the way in which the film is, or TV show is presenting to you its ideology. You read it for your what it's telling you in its more unconscious dimension. Right? So if you recognize offensive stereotypes on a TV show, you're reading it oppositional. Right? That would be a sort of very basic, obvious example. One example he gives, if you hear the term national interest from a politician and you read it as class interest or read it as the interests of the politicians themselves, that's an oppositional reading. Right? And that oppositional readings are common and ordinary, right? Not only for people with an apparatus of ideological criticism behind them. And that's one of Stuart Hall's great legacies is looking at vernacular forms of opposition, the way ordinary people use popular culture in all kinds of positive ways, but differently perhaps than ways in which it reinforces power or dominant ideology. Okay, so I'll stop there with Stuart Hall, and I want to then show the film, which is related to television. It's from 1992, and it's called Color Adjustment. So it's a film about the representation of race in American television for sort of the first 40 years of American television. And it's directed by a filmmaker named Marlon Riggs, who did some very sort of experimental, what we could say are films that experiment with the signifier, but this is in some ways a fairly conventional documentary. It's not one that formally may be that surprising, but there are a couple reasons to bring it in, and again I'm trying to show you things that both connect each week, if possible, to the current week, and also extend into the next week. The next week we will read about different forms of cinema, different forms, as well as television form as well, the history of typical forms of television narrative. And next week is essentially about narrative paradigms. And so that's one thing you can certainly observe here, are some of those elements, particularly the centrality of the type of family shows that dominate a lot of television and will be emphasized in the film. But I also want to bring in the question of race, which will come up in other readings as well, of course. But Marxist ideological readings have been important for feminism, for critical race theory, and so on. But there is an emphasis in Marxism on class, right? And race is obviously and gender are linked to class, but those links are often complicated, and that's another thing that one needs to theorize. So the last thing I'll say is, of course, television has changed a lot in the last 20 years, whether it's changed all for the better or not, whether a lot of the things that are brought up in this have gone away is certainly an open question. But television form has changed a lot too. But for that very reason, I think it's useful to also think about the history of television form. So I think people, there's suddenly this new explosive interest in television as this kind of vital artistic medium, and television is changing just by the fact that we no longer necessarily need to watch it in real time in the way we used to. But there's a history of television that gets forgotten too, because people don't usually think of TV as having much of a history. And this, I'm sure, will expose you to many TV shows that you haven't been aware